Okay, so we're back to start again for some more lectures. Most of it looks the same. The big change I have to acknowledge is I got this scratch on my chin here. That came from my son. We have battles where he's a 5-year-old and we kind of wrestle around. It usually ends up with me kind of getting my butt kicked, and so he's usually some kind of superhero character that he makes up for himself. So this time it was Wolverine. With the claws, which didn't work out so well for my face. So that's the major change from the last time we did the lecture. But beyond that, I think we're ready to go, so we can kind of pick up and kind of continue on where we left off. So the way I recollect it, we were ready to do Chinese dates, which in the Chinese is Da Zhao. Da means great or big, and Zhao is a date, and presumably they're kind of a larger size date. These are not really the same as the kind of American dates that you would get in the supermarket. There are some differences here. I don't think it makes a perfect substitution. It looks like the American dates are sweeter and probably tonify more fluids, though you could probably debate that point. In any case, not the same deal exactly, and I think if you want to get exactly the effects of a Chinese date, you have to make sure the person has Chinese dates. We'll have some recipes that we'll do on Tuesday that will include Chinese dates, and however you want to handle that with patients, you'll handle that however you do it. I think you can always kind of use the solution we were talking about before. You can get things kind of in a powder, and then just put a concentrated amount into a soup that you're preparing or something like that, or a patient would be preparing. So it's just something you're gonna have to decide however you want to handle it. But obviously, you can get fresh dates for people, and however that works out is how it works out. But anyway, it's kind of an important ingredient. And important for cooking purposes because it hides some of the other stronger tasting things, like in the astragalus or dangguai. If you have enough sweet things like Chinese dates and goji berries, and all of a sudden those recipes become much more palatable for people, and the whole thing just works out better. So important, I think, as a nutritional thing, but also important just for the palate, I guess you'd say. All right, so what does it do? The properties are sweet and neutral. We know sweet things tend to work through the earth and tend to be tonifying. The temperature here is neutral. Things that are warmer will tonify qi, and things that are cooler will tend to tonify yin. In this case, it's kind of neutral, so it's kind of an interesting call. The way it ends up working out is this is considered a qi tonic, though it probably also tonifies blood. And it's a big red date, so it's tend to thought to be good just by a signature thing for the fire phase, especially for the heart. It doesn't exactly say that in the notes that we have in front of us, but that's sort of the understanding of this. In any case, in the notes in front of us, it says tonifies the spleen and augments the qi, and it gives some symptoms here: weakness, fatigue, shortness of breath, reduced appetite, loose stools. Loose stools is a bit controversial here, right? You can kind of tonify the qi with these dates, but the dates themselves are kind of heavy and more cloying. So a lot of people will have the opinion if the stools are really loose, you might want to pull this out actually. So better as a qi and blood tonic than something that you would give, say, for example, for diarrhea. That wouldn't be the right way to think about this. Okay, what else does it do? Nourishes the blood and calms the spirit. That's the red part, that's the signature part, that's the fire phase idea. And it'll end up being used for things that are physical symptoms of the heart, but also good for emotional symptoms of the heart. This goes back to the idea that sweet is moderating. Sweet is moderating to the wood, sweet is moderating to the fire, so it's good to moderate the liver and the heart, though here the emphasis is being put on the heart. And so you get this idea that it's used for what they call restless organ disorder. This is zhang zhao in the Chinese. You don't need to know that if you're an acupuncturist, but if you're an herbalist, you'll see that phrase. And so basically it's used in sort of combinations that are soothing. I had mentioned before that there are students and people I know, even as faculty members, who prepare these kind of soothing teas, kind of in the generic sense. And this goes into this idea of sort of calming the restless organs, treating the zhang zhao. Next piece, moderates and harmonizes the harsh qualities of other herbs. That's not a big deal for us because we're doing cooking, so we're not going to be cooking with anything that's harsh in any way, but can be mentioned, and it does fit to the idea that sweet things will tend to kind of cover the more difficult things to the palate that you'd have in other herbs, and we'll definitely see that in the recipes that we're going to look at. All right, with that, we can turn the page. Next really important one is gancao. This is licorice. A lot of what will happen here is that this will be honey fried. When you honey fry it, you make it more sweet, and you probably warm it up a little bit. So it's sweet and neutral in its own character just by itself, and the Chinese like prepare it a lot, and it gets prepared in honey, and so it becomes more warm, and then, you know, again, the sweet qualities go up with the honey as well. So that's the sort of general gist of it. There's another special thing here that's mentioned. It's a bit obscure, and I haven't talked about it a lot because a lot of clinicians don't take it that seriously, even historically, but there is this idea of what channels things enter, and the idea of licorice is it enters all the channels. So it has sort of a general property to the whole body, connects in all over to all different parts of the system, so that's kind of an interesting observation. All right, indications specifically that go back to our particular flavor theory is that it tonifies the spleen and augments the qi, commonly used for spleen deficiency with shortness of breath, lassitude, loose stools, also for qi and blood deficiency patterns that may show an irregular or intermittent pulse or palpitation. So there's a couple of things going on here. First off to understand is that for the most part, this is going to be when it's prepared, when it's honey fried. That's where you can get most of these qualities of tonifying the spleen and treating things like loose stools and shortness of breath and those kinds of things. This is sweet, tonifying the earth that can also then go through the generating cycle to treat the metal, right? That's our theory. Then we also have the idea that it's good for the heart. So it tonifies the qi of the heart. You can think of that as going like through the spleen into the heart. But on the other hand, there's also this idea that we talked about before, which is that sweet things moderate the heart. So in this case, that sweet idea of moderating the heart is also being used here. The palpitations is sort of the heart behaving erratically, and if you give something sweet to harmonize it and to moderate it, then the heart will sort of go back more to its healthy functioning, right? So that's the basic idea of this. So useful idea for sure. When you honey fry this, you lose some of the taste of licorice. I'm not into licorice. A lot of people aren't into licorice. The honey fried thing makes it much sweeter. It kind of masks some of the more, I don't even know how to describe that flavor, but the unpleasant part of eating licorice is a little bit masked. So that's obviously for the best. Still, not a good thing for soups. You have to try to get this into a congee or a tea or oatmeal maybe for Americans. You need some other route to get this in here. So when we look at the ZZJ combinations where there's lots of cinnamon and dates and honey fried licorice, that's more like probably the route you'll have to try to use these things in. Next, moistens the lung and stops coughing. We've seen a number of qi tonics that also generate fluids. That was true of ginseng. It's also true here now of licorice. So you're tonifying the lung qi, but you're also generating more fluid. So if you have some dryness in the lungs, this will help too. Because of its neutral properties when it's unprocessed, this can be good for heat or cold in the lungs. I would say, you tend to use EZJ as sort of a starting point for this, and he does tend to use this honey fried even for the lungs itself. So it's not the assumption here that you're using this unprepared. A lot of times it's like he's using this prepared. Clears heat and relieves toxicity. That's the next bullet point. Here it's used more raw, and it treats the throat. That's a big deal. This also fits into the idea of sort of a 5-phase thing where you drain through the child. So the sweet flavor can drain away from the extra heat that's building up in the fire phase. This is a bit of a tricky idea here. I won't test a lot of it. Well, maybe it might come up on the test. So just know the concept. What happens is that you have heat. It collects in the fire phase a little bit. So the pulse rate goes up. The heat starts to flare up. It gets into the throat. And this heat in the throat then causes the throat to get kind of inflamed, and then the licorice drains away the heat from the fire phase that's causing this flaring up that's getting into the throat. So it's kind of a tricky roundabout way of talking about how this works on some level, but it's a clever application of 5-phase theory, and it's talked about in this way. So good to hear this. It's kind of interesting. So if you have like someone who just has like a dry, sore throat, not necessarily infection, Zhang Zhengjing will say that you can use licorice, and he does actually in that case even recommend it unprepared, which is a bit more unusual for him to generate qi and moisten the throat. In other situations, though, it will be used even honey fried to treat the throat. And there's just some interesting things with this. Now, I don't think if you have a severe infection in the throat that you can just give someone licorice and cure it. That's probably not going to happen, obviously. But licorice is used with other things to help deal with even infections of the throat that are pretty bad, like strep throat and things like that, and does work. So in any case, kind of an interesting application. How much we'll use of that in the food therapy sense, I don't know. But certainly if you have people who use their voice a lot and the throat gets dry and the lung qi is kind of weak, that's certainly an applicable thing to do. Moderates spasm and alleviates pain. So for painful spasms of the abdomen or the legs, what's going on there? Spasms have to do more with the liver, regulating the qi and wind. And the idea here is that when you use a sweet flavor, you end up moderating the liver. That's one of the things that we had, I think, in chapter 22 of the Su Wen. I want to say 22 or 24, I get that mixed up. But in any case, we covered a lot of those applications of the flavors in that kind of complicated section where we had the Su Wen and Zhang Jingyue both commenting. We went over that a while ago. So the idea there is that the sweet flavor moderates the liver, and that's good for spasms. And that's a pretty common usage. To do it perfect, you usually need other things that will also treat the liver. For us as food therapy people, you're probably talking about mint, right? And then maybe dates. Though technically speaking, you get the sour flavor doing this a lot if you want to look at it from an herbalist point of view for herbalists who are, taking this class and doing an herb thing too. So that usually is more like a baishao or something, the white peony. And we talked about the white peony problem many times, the fact that you want to be able to use white peony and it's right. It's not a food stuff. It's sour, but it's not horrendous. So, depending how seriously you want to do this for yourself, like we talked about before, you can kind of look and say whether or not you can get someone to ingest something like that. It's not the worst, though. It's obviously not something that people would choose, based on its taste. All right, if we move along, the next thing I want to talk about here is shan yao. Shan yao is Chinese yam, and it means mountain herb. Shan is kind of the mountain there. So the description on this thing is sweet and neutral. This is a number of qi tonics that we've seen now that have sort of this neutral quality to them, but they're still considered to be tonifying of qi. So that's kind of interesting. With shan yao, we'll get some of the basic ideas of tonifying the spleen and the stomach, and it is good for things like diarrhea and fatigue. Notice also it says spontaneous sweating. I know the copy here isn't great down at the bottom, but there's spontaneous sweating and loss of appetite that's a little bit hidden here. So what's happening here, and this is really kind of interesting, is that even though the flavor of the thing is sweet and neutral, there's like a tinge of sour to it. And in that sour, we know sour is astringing. Sour can be astringing in a lot of different parts of the body. It can be astringing on the exterior, which is good for sweating. It can be astringing in the lower jiao, which is good for things like diarrhea. And sometimes I'll talk about other kinds of things with astringing here too in the lower jiao. Gynecological problems like maybe non-infectious leukorrhea could have shan yao treating them because of this little tinge of sour to it. And then also male premature ejaculation kind of example pathologies where there's loss of containment in the lower jiao for male patients. So handy herb, it's relatively mild, so it's the idea that you take it over a long period of time. It can be part of sort of just general health and longevity kind of medicine. And the trick is really to see that it's sweet and neutral, but also with maybe a hint of sour. It doesn't say it in the books, but I've cooked with it before, and when you cook with it, you sort of taste that little bit of sour with it, even though the texts don't say that it's sour. I mean, to the palate, it's a little tiny bit, it seems to me. And again, it's also considered to have these astringent qualities to it, so it kind of all goes together in that way. If we turn the page, we get a few more things about it. Tonifies qi and augments yin. Now, we've seen this with a couple of other ingredients where they're able to tonify qi and sort of augment fluids, or in this case, they're going a little bit farther and they're saying yin, which is even a little bit deeper than fluids. So in a long-term tonifying kind of a way, it does have this way of helping protect the yin, right, of the lungs, and then it probably even has something a little bit to do with the kidneys as well, because the next bullet point says tonifies the kidney and stabilizes and binds. So stabilize and binds means that you're treating, you're astringing again, essentially, right? It's the same astringing concept. So the point is that it has these sour qualities, which does this astringing in the lower jiao, and therefore good for the kidneys in sort of a long-term kind of a way. Again, it'll show up in combinations that could treat things like hot flashes in female patients. It can show up in things where there are Again, lower jiao issues in male patients. It's kind of an interesting thing, and it's neutral, so it can be kind of slid into things where you want to make more yin, and it can also be slid into things where you want to make more yang. So the neutral quality is kind of used for its benefit. Other examples of this would be things like wasting thirsting disorder, which it can be kind of used in a safe way. One of the things about this that's worthwhile pointing out then is that the Chinese will use ingredients that they're labeling sweet for diabetic presentations. As a Western person, you might think, well, I don't ever want to do that because they're sweet in the textbooks. Therefore, I don't want to have people taking things that are sweet when they're already having problems with sweet. But the things that they're talking about being sweet here aren't really that sweet to like the Western palate. It's a yam, it's a little sweet, but it's not sweet. It's not even sweet like the way sweet potatoes are when they're prepared or something, if you just look at it just intrinsically and you're just tossing it into a soup. So that's kind of an interesting thing just to see there. And then as it goes along farther in the list of symptoms, it talks about binding the essence and treating things like spermatorrhea, frequent urination, and vaginal discharge, which is the stuff that we already mentioned. So that is Shan-Yao in a nutshell. You got that all covered. Next page, we're going to talk about wheat Fu Shao Mai. This is kind of light wheat grain. It says not quite ripe, or it just says wheat overall. Again, it's kind of an interesting thing. It's not like, I guess, if you go eat a bunch of bread, you're going to get all these effects necessarily. So I think if you want to be guaranteed that you're getting these effects, you might have to use this in a powdered form or something as part of a cooking process, or it could serve nicely in a tea again that sort of calms the mind. The flavor description here is sweet, but then also a little bit salty, which makes sense. And it goes more to the cool side here. So this is interesting. If you look at the top of the page, it says herbs that stabilize and bind. So these are things that have astringing qualities. And we're going to see this in a number of ingredients where they're going to be considered to astringe, and therefore they probably have a wee bit of sour quality to them, just because of their functions. Even though not all of them will taste necessarily sour, and wheat, does it taste sour? Not so much, but it still has a little bit of a sour quality to it. Even though it's not saying it there, it's the best way for us to think about it in flavor theory. And I know people who think of wheat in a sour way, think about this Fu Shao Mai in a sour way, while at the same time acknowledging that it isn't sour like the way real super sour ingredients are. But what they're getting to is the idea of astringing. So this thing stops excess sweating due to deficiency, and it just lists all kinds of possible presentations where they're sweating, which means this can be used in a variety of contexts. And itchy eye. So that's one of the main ideas with this. The other main idea, which you have to turn the page to get a little clipped otherwise, is that it nourishes the heart and calms the spirit. And it mentions symptoms like palpitation and insomnia, irritability, emotional instability, and then we get back to that restless organ thing again. That's that Zhang Zhao idea. So this is sour treating the heart, or that astringing quality treating the heart. Sweats the fluid of the heart, so it can treat sweating. Sour things or astringing things also affect the mind, right? We talked about the idea that sour things can kind of pull back the Shen and stop it from being so restless and agitated where it seems like it's scattered and kind of the mind is going all over the place. It kind of pulls it back in, and in that sense calms it, right, by stopping it from being so scattered and dispersed. And probably all of us have had the experience of this dispersed, agitated mental state that almost needs to be pulled back. So that's what they're getting to there through this idea of nourishing the heart and calming the spirit. One last little thing, again, not a major thing probably for most of our practices or in a lot of formulas, but maybe a good kind of folk thing again would be used for bedwetting in children with its kind of mild astringing qualities, being handy in kids. I haven't fully used that clinically. I don't do a lot of peds, but it is kind of an interesting observation, probably part of almost a Chinese folk understanding of what this does. So kind of an interesting idea there. All right, so that is wheat. Next on the docket, we have to turn again to the next page, and we're looking at Huang Jing. This is on the bottom of the page. It says 325 up at the top. Huang means yellow. Jing is essence, kind of like the way the essence is talked about in the 5 substances. Its flavor profile is sweet and neutral. It's considered to be a qi and fluid tonic, and to see more about this, we almost have to flip the page and we'll get more of the specifics of this. But it makes sense. Sweet works through the spleen. When you get things that are sweet into the spleen, depending on their temperature and other qualities, you'll get either more qi or more fluids or more blood. So it's the same concept we've been looking at. So here it says tonifies the spleen qi and augments the spleen yin. Spleen yin is always kind of an interesting idea when that's kind of presented. So let's deal with the qi part first. It says, for spleen and stomach qi deficiency with lassitude, fatigue, and loss of appetite. Okay, so we get very clearly why the flavor theory would work here and what's going on. Then it says, also for spleen and stomach yin. I think for most of us, the easier way to understand this is stomach yin than spleen yin. Though there is that kind of terminological thing. We saw Flaws doing this too, where there is this tendency to talk about spleen yin and then mean spleen qi deficiency coupled with some kind of stomach heat and yin deficiency. So it's a bit of a semantic thing. I suppose for a board, if that comes up, you'll be able to, wrestle with that kind of a question. That it depends on, who's writing the book, who's writing the test, how they want to use this language. But certainly when you have heat in the stomach and it starts to damage yin, then people might start to use this terminology, and you end up with this cluster of spleen qi deficiency and then stomach yin deficiency with heat as well. And so if you follow it through, then it lists some symptoms here. Dry mouth, the esophagus and the mouth are probably dry. On the other hand, there's a loss of appetite due to qi deficiency. There's drier stools as opposed to loose stools, so you kind of get the idea of where this is going. Next bullet point, moistens the lungs. This is a dry cough without a lot of sputum. So when you get the dry coughs, that makes total sense, and it's really kind of treating qi and yin deficiency. And so it says for coughs due to consumption, that's obviously long-term infectious disease, kind of drying out the lungs. The lungs get vulnerable, are vulnerable to qi and yin deficiency, so you can kind of see why this herb is being kind of presented in this way. Then finally, it's called yellow essence, so you imagine it should have some tonification for the kidney itself, and that's the last bullet point. Tonifies the kidney and augments the essence. It says kidney deficiency and waning essence with lower back pain, things like lightheadedness, weakness of the lower extremities. Okay, second to last bullet point. Last bullet point used for wasting thirsting disorder. Like I said, there are things that are sweet that they're still going to use, and this is one of the ones that gets highlighted a lot. So as a simple, relatively mild herb that's thrown in a lot for treating qi and yin shu in wasting thirsting patients, this is one of the things that certainly is on the table and is mentioned in the Chinese modern literature. All right, so it sounds like a great thing. You assume it being a ton of formulas. I remember learning this thing when I was a student, studying the herbal aspect, not the nutrition aspect, but I thought, well, I should use Huangjing all the time. It's used pretty rare. It's used pretty rarely, so it's not that commonly used, in general herbal formulas and things like that. But for cooking purposes, it actually is used, and I think there are parts of China where this is considered to be a common ingredient, and we'll look at a soup recipe where you can put it in. It's sweet. And so it adds some sweetness to a broth, which again is always kind of handy in the Chinese world because you can cover some of the ingredients that have more bite, like we've been talking about. And it cooks okay. It kind of like, it has this kind of thicker part that kind of almost cooks off. It leaves this little residue, so you might have to filter it out or something like that, right? When you're doing your cooking. Filter isn't the right word for that, but I can't remember the right one. I can't remember. But anyways, you're going to have to get rid of it. And, but, kind of adds a sweeter taste to a broth, and that's always a handy kind of a deal, while still having these good qualities of tonifying qi and yin. There's a lady I knew from the south of China who, would cook with this, for example. And in the south, the idea would be that you're exposed to a lot of heat, and you sweat a lot, so your qi and yin gets deficient, so it was sort of a staple in a lot of the recipes. And again, we'll definitely have a recipe where this will be included. All right, moving along. Next on the list, which is another kind of great southern recipe, soup kind of a thing too, and we'll look at it in the recipe used that way, is lily bulb. Lily bulb is an extremely interesting little foodstuff / medicinal. In Chinese, it's bai he. This means 100 meetings. The flavor profile is sweet, slightly bitter, and slightly cold. And it's again considered to be one of these astringing things. So there probably is some idea that it again is a little bit sour. It seems to me, to my palate, it has that thing. even though sour isn't listed here. But it definitely has astringent qualities to it. Most people would agree, I think. In any case, when you look at it, it says moistens the lung, clears heat, and stops cough. So sweet things can generate qi, blood, or yin, and in this case, it's considered to generate more yin. So for dry lung or lung heat, coughs, and sore throat, it is protecting the yin. And then if you look at it, if you consider it a little bit sour, a little bit bitter, that also can be good for cough. If you remember, we have bitter that helps to descend the lung. Bitter things are descending. So that can help cough when you have things that are stuck in the lungs and the lung needs to kind of get its proper movement back established. Sort of wheezing patterns maybe could be like this, or cough patterns where you need to kind of descend to help calm the lung. And then the other part, if you're a little bit astringent or something, and that's a debatable point for sure. But if you are, then that helps cough as well. Next, clears the heart and calms the spirit. And this is for symptoms like low-grade fever, insomnia, restlessness, and irritability in the aftermath of a febrile disease. Also for palpitations brought on by insufficiency of qi and yin. So here we're getting the idea of using this to calm the spirit. All of the little flavors that we mentioned can do something different to the spirit depending how you want to frame the question. Sweet things are moderating. Bitter things can clear a little heat from the heart. And again, we're talking about residual heat from fevers and things like that. And that the fact that it's cold helps that out too. So that's the basic idea, kind of heat in the organs in the upper jiao. And then finally, they mentioned even palpitations. So kind of an interesting idea. Zhan Zhengjing, who is kind of a template for a lot of this kind of stuff, has a whole chapter where he talks about lily bulb diseases. These are things that you specifically want to use lily bulb for. And one of the interesting points he makes is a lot of these patients will look kind of Xiaoyang. So I may test on this for our final in a couple of weeks, so maybe know this point. I mean, there's lots of stuff here, obviously. But one of the things I certainly could ask about, and probably will be this idea of a lily bulb disorder, where it looks Xiaoyang in that there's kind of alternating hot and cold. It does show up a lot in the aftermath of febrile diseases. And he has kind of an interesting description of a person who sort of feels Xiaoyangy indecisive too. So he says people who can't make up their mind if they want to sleep or they want to stay up. They can't make up their mind if they want to be still or they want to move around. They can't make up their mind if they want to eat or not eat. There's this whole sort of little torn thing, lack of decisiveness that will definitely look Xiaoyang, but in this case it's more having to do with this heat that's agitating the heart. So it's sort of an interesting point that he makes there. Anyways, that is lily bulb, and that part's done. We can turn the page. There's a little bit here on watermelon. It's not a really important ingredient in Chinese culture, but it is something that we eat in the West, so I decided just to include it here. It gives us a little bit of a different profile too. So in this case, it's sweet and cold. I haven't done too many cold ingredients, so now we're getting something that officially is considered to be cold. It's kind of interesting from a signature point of view because when they talk about it, they say there are things that are adapted to their environment because they have a similar quality to the environment. Things that are warm that can be in a warm environment, let's say. This will be true of seafood. Some of the seafood will be kind of cool. Some of the seafood will go the opposite way, and that's what's curious. Sometimes things develop a signature, a quality related to to their environment, where it's working in the opposite direction, and that's sort of the idea here. Watermelon would grow in a hot climate and develop very cool qualities in order to be able to be in that climate. So again, it's a cooling cold food, and I think the general idea is you eat it in the summertime and it helps to generate fluids and it helps to deal with the extra heat in the body. And so they give a description for this in the first bullet point. Significant thirst and dark scanty urine in the context of summer heat. It's also considered to be probably a little bit bland then, because if you look at the next bullet point, it promotes urination, and it may be used even specifically for jaundice, being good for things that are affecting maybe even the liver. Anyways, it's not a real common usage. You don't see it in a lot of formulas, but just sort of an interesting kind of more modern application, I think. All right, so that is watermelon, kind of a bit of an aside, but sort of an interesting one. I'm going to end this video. I think we probably just have one more to go, and that will conclude everything we want to cover within this. So I will be back in another video shortly, and we'll continue on with the packet. We'll be able to talk about Qianxi. So we'll be back in a second. Bye-bye.